I was born on September 11th, 9/11, and I was immediately given up for adoption. I was adopted by a white Jewish couple who were behavioral scientists. And it was interesting because this introduced in my life at the very beginning a theme that was to recur and really create the trajectory of my life, which is giving, generosity. They gave a lot of money, adoption fees, all of that. And not only did they give money in raising me until I was 18 years old, but they gave emotionally, mentally, especially in my teenage years, probably more so than they ever anticipated. If they would have known, they might have made a different decision at the very beginning. But they gave deeply. And they had a birth son already, my older brother, who is now a cellular biologist at Columbia. So I was literally the black sheep of the family growing up. Not just biologically, but also they were scientists, they were measured, they were methodical, and I was always the artist and spontaneous. Fast forward 31 years, I was reunited with my birth parents. My birth father, who's black Jehovah's Witness, my birth mother, who's white Irish Catholic. And again, when I think about the relationship we have today, having been reunited, they've been able to give to me since we've been reunited. And they, 3 years after they gave me up for adoption, they ended up getting back together and years later had another child who they did raise, my younger sister, who is now in New York practicing law. So in the end, basically, I am a black, white, Jewish, Irish Catholic Jehovah's Witness who grew up playing the violin. And my life has been filled with this diversity kind of theme and in the arts. So I started playing when I was 5, and yeah, I know. And I'm going to tell you a little about the afro in just a second, although it's not such a great story. So I started, and I grew up in New York. And when I was 10 years old, I moved to Hershey, Pennsylvania. At the time, there was one black family in my school and me. Playing the violin, last name Dworkin, big afro. It wasn't exactly working. And the kids, instead of giving, they actually really took from me emotionally and mentally. They would do this thing, they would put their hand on their elbow and reach up and say, "Give Dorkmeister the afro clutch." And they would grab my afro. Drove me deeper into my violin and the experience that I had with the arts. But luckily, I was able to go to the Interlochen Arts Academy for my last 2 years of high school, which I credit with saving my life. Not only was I having troubles with my parents and running away and getting kicked out, but it was the first time in my life where I was surrounded by everyone who was in the arts. And it was more about what you were doing artistically than anything about various cliques. And also during that time, giving recurred in my life, not only with friends who really did give and became lifelong friends, but I was on scholarship. And so I found myself at these donor dinners, and I didn't understand it. There were all these older people, they didn't know me at all, and we would sit there, and I would have to say thank you for my scholarship. Someone may have done that in here. But what astounded me was their joy. They seemed to derive a personal joy out of giving to me. And it made a mark, an indelible mark in my mind, even though I didn't understand it at the time. After Interlochen, I ended up at Penn State. I was concertmaster of the Penn State Philharmonic, but my problems with my parents continued. I ended up having a major breakout with them, and they ended up not talking to me and kind of disowning me, if you will, from the age of 19 to 25. So I couldn't stay in school. I ended up dropping out, and I moved to Michigan, living in Lansing and Kalamazoo and ultimately Ann Arbor. And while I was here, I was very isolated, but there was also someone who gave, and that was my adoptive grandmother. She would send a card on my birthday and on the holidays, and in the card was initially $20, and then that got up to $40, which was major money at the time, enabled me to live in a way that I couldn't otherwise live. But more importantly, it was what those cards meant to me. And in my very brief conversations that I would have with her on the phone, I realized that she derived joy from being there when she knew that the rest of my family was not. And around the same time, I began to have this kind of cultural entrepreneurial spirit. I didn't know those words at the time. All I knew was that I wanted to change the world around me, even though I had nothing. Had no car, had no resources. I was just struggling day to day, but I still wanted to change the world. And I had almost been homeless and had several friends who were homeless who stayed with me, so that issue was very prominent. And I thought I could do something about it, so I started a homeless organization. Even though I didn't have a car or anything like that, barely had an apartment, I didn't really know what I was doing, so things didn't go well. So as a last-ditch effort, I sent out about 100 letters to celebrities that I thought would care. And one of the people that I sent a letter to was Robin Williams. This is a picture of him from that time. So I got all these rejections, and of course I couldn't keep the organization going, so the organization folded. 2 months later, I get a call, and I was really wary of answering the phone because it was usually bill collectors. And the phone rang, and I did pick it up, and a woman said, "My name's Marsha Williams. I'm calling about a letter to my husband." Robin Williams' wife! Oh my God! And then it dawned on me that the very first thing I was going to have to share was how what I had written them about had failed, and that there wasn't any really reason for her to be calling. But that immediately led to a conversation about my life, and especially about being isolated, and how all I wanted to do was be able to go back to school, go back to my music. But I couldn't, because at this point, I owed all my loans to Penn State, so they wouldn't free up my transcript. All my federal loans were in default. And we had this amazing conversation, and she said, why don't you send copies of your student loans to Robin and me, and we'll see if there's something we can do to help. So I gather up all the copies of the student loans and make copies, send them. I had a copy of a recital I gave at Penn State. I sent that too. I had poetry I had written, everything. I just sent it all off. Meanwhile, life continued. Got evicted, moved into a cheaper apartment, ended up getting a job in the mailroom of a local marketing company. And then 2 months after that, an envelope came from the Joel Faden Financial Companies. And in it, it said on the cover letter, "Enclosed, please find copies of checks made out in your behalf from Robin Williams' account." And they had paid off all of my loans to Penn State and had caught all my federal loans up out of default. And it was truly extraordinary. And as I was thinking about that and ending up being able to continue to have communications, and he continued to give in a variety of ways in my life, I realized that he derived personal, individual joy of giving. It brought him pleasure. And years later, we were joking about it, and he said, if I would have known you would have gone on to do these various things, I would have given you more money. and what I realized is that he wasn't saying, if I would have given you more money, you would have done more. He was saying, if I would have given you more money, it would have meant even more to me. It was a very powerful experience for me. So because of his support, I was able to return to school, here to the University of Michigan. And now that cultural entrepreneurial spirit kept continuing, except now it was very focused on what had been, at that point, my life's experience and work, which was music and diversity. And so I ended up being very, very frustrated with not seeing diversity in this incredible art form. And so I thought, if we had a competition for young Black and Latino string players, that would just solve everything, and we'd make the entire field of classical music diverse. So I very quickly learned it would take more than that, and over the past 20 years, Sphinx has been able to develop into really an international NGO, reaching over 20 million in audiences, 100,000 students, through its mission, which is transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. But that all began, and I founded the organization when I was an underclassman here. So I'm like, say what, right? How does that happen? So yes, I was dedicated, and yes, this was something that was, this core of my life, but the reality is that there were a lot of other people's generosity that empowered it and made this possible. And one of the first people that I reached out to was James Wolfenson, who was president of the World Bank when I was a student here. So I figured, who has more money? I need money to be able to do this project. I'll write the president of the World Bank. He was a cellist, so I figured he's got to love music, and so this is perfect. By a very odd, circuitous route that I had no power over, my letter landed on his desk. Again, there's something about this 2 months. I think it must take most donors 2 months to figure things out. 2 months later, a letter comes, not even a full business-size envelope, but a half-size. So I'm like, this is clearly a rejection. Because the size of the envelope always matters when you're hearing news, right? It's like the smaller the envelope, oh my God, this is not good news. I open it, and inside, very brief, just a couple sentences, says, "This sounds like a fantastic project. Here is a one-time $10,000 $1,000 gift. Go to it. Signed, James Wolfenson, president of the World Bank. And that led to, again, communications and a lifelong relationship where he continued to give, because a year later I had to go back and say, I know you said one time, but this is really great what we're doing. So, and he did continue to give. And what was so astounding to me was the personal joy that I saw him experience. Here was someone who was literally dealing with billions of dollars and countries and societies as a whole, but he derived a personal, intense joy of giving and making a difference in one person's life. Around the same time, Isaac Stern, one of the most prominent violinists of our era, Yo-Yo Ma, one of the most incredible human artist citizens of our time, gave not just of money and financial resources, but of their talent, of their reputation, and of their time to our young Sphinx artists. And as you can see from these pictures, the personal joy that they experienced was completely profound and something that I continue to think about over the years. This is a picture of my wife, Afa, and I as we were on the Queen Mary crossing the Atlantic to Europe, which, believe it or not, you can actually do for about $750. It's pretty amazing. There's different types of cabins on the ship. So we're crossing, and one of the things that's amazing is you're 7 days at sea, but kind of like a summer camp, it condenses time. So the people that you meet and the relationships you build sometimes become lifelong relationships. And out of the 4,000 people on the ship, we met 2 people who were doctors from Michigan. So we're talking with them and we're sharing the work that we do, and they said, well, you should come by our stateroom. And we went by their stateroom, and they had brought on the ship these giant scrapbooks. And they shared with us how every year they would travel to sub-Saharan Africa and they would set up a clinic literally in the middle of nowhere. And people would literally walk for days to come to their clinic to be treated. And it was an amazing project, an amazing story. And they had all these pictures and stories, and they shared this one story with us of this 8-year-old boy who came to the clinic, and his body had been ravaged by AIDS. And they talked about treating him, but more they talked about the way in which they interacted and what they learned about him and about his family, the people in his family who were still alive. And it was profound. We ended up going back to our stateroom, and we were thinking about this, and we felt like there was something missing. We had to do more. And we had been trying to have a baby, and we had not been successful for a while, and so we were like, this is it. We need to adopt an African baby. This is what we need to do. We need to do something with more meaning. I was adopted. We could create we have a biracial, multiracial home and all of that. We could do incredible things, so we need to adopt a child. We need to do something more than what we're doing in the arts, because we felt like they're saving lives and we are, making a difference, but we're not saving anybody's life. And so the next day we saw them in that evening, and we sat there and we shared with them how profound what they had told us was. And we were like, and so here's what's going to happen. And actually, Afa even emailed back from the ship to her doctor asking to ship her pills over to Italy where we were going to be. And they said, whoa, hold the phone. Don't get it twisted. We have never saved anyone's life through this project. That boy that we were telling you about died 3 months after we left. We didn't stay. We don't save anyone's life. We may prolong life, which is a good thing. They said, we do this because of the joy it brings us, because of the human connection we experience with other people. And that's why we do it. And medicine happens to be our craft, our discipline. But isn't that what you're doing in the arts? That gave us pause, and we continued to think about it. And we thought about it for the rest of the journey, and we ended up in Italy, and Afa's pills actually came, and we realized she was late. And when our first doctor visit came, and we went and they dated back, we realized that we had conceived that very night on the ship. And as we began to think about family, we thought about how we wanted to make sure we tried to live up to that ideal of giving with our children and with our boys, especially with unconditional love, which is something that unfortunately I didn't always receive in my family. There's one last story that I want to share that was just a couple months ago that happened in Davos, Switzerland. And these are some Sphinx artists with Robert Smith, one of the great philanthropic leaders nowadays and has just truly transformed many areas and fields and educational institutions, especially the arts. And he made this possible for Sphinx Artists to be able to go to Davos. And what stood out to me was that Afa was there, and she called, and this is this global convening of all these leaders, and they're talking about changes in the world and society. And Robert's part of all those meetings, but she said, you should see his joy of spending time with our artists. It just moves him in a way that seems profound. And what we know is that these aren't just stories. Research tells us that giving is different. And while money can buy happiness, up to usually about a middle-class income, it buys no further happiness, increases no happiness beyond a middle-class income, except when you are giving your money to someone else. That's from the journal Science. Journal of Psychological Science concludes that giving to others is the exception to what they refer to as hedonic adaptation. This is when, as we do things that give us pleasure or bring us happiness, if we do them repeatedly over time, the amount of happiness we get decreases. You love riding roller coasters. You get on a roller coaster. The first time, it's amazing. It transforms your life. Like, this is incredible. You ride the roller coaster 20 times. The 20th time, it is not bringing the same level of satisfaction. We know that. So what they did was they gave a whole bunch of money to a whole bunch of people. They said, spend this repeatedly on yourself. And they did. And what they found is they tracked their happiness as it decreased over time. They gave the same group of people a whole bunch of money, and they said, spend this repeatedly on someone else. And what they find is that the happiness levels not only maintain, but in some instances actually increase. There is something unique about the human condition when we give. And so as you leave here this evening, I encourage you to give something financial, of yourself, of your talent, of your time, every single day, beginning today. And when you give an amount that brings meaning, not to who you're giving it to, give an amount that gives meaning to you. Because the greater the value of what you give, the greater the impact will be on you. And it is something now that I strive to do each and every day. As I reflect back on this extraordinary life that I'm able to experience, that throughout it, it was made possible through truly the selfish joy of giving by others. And I encourage you to think about, what can you do in terms of giving, not only because you could potentially transform the world around you, but most importantly, because of how it might transform you. Thank you very much.